Hello and welcome to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. The U.S. Secretary of Defense Ashton Carter recently made a speech that was as direct as it was blunt. Emerging global powers such as Russia and China are a threat to the Washington-centric world and need to be challenged. Well now, who's upping the ante? To Crosstalk, the changing global order, I'm joined by my guest, Pepe Escobar in Bangkok. He is a roving correspondent for the Asia Times. In Phoenix, we have Patrick Henningsen. He is a journalist, writer, and founder of the news website 21stCenturyWire.com. And in New York, we cross to Daniel Wagner. He is the CEO of Country Risk Solutions. All right, gentlemen, you've all been on the program many times before. Crosstalk rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want. Pepe, I looked at the Ashton Carter speech quite carefully. You wrote about it. Are the two countries, Russia and China, a direct threat to the Washington-centric world? And what's your take on the whiny level? Because it was a whiny speech, a speech of such whine level that I've never heard before. Go ahead.
Peter, it's a beautiful, balmy night here in Thailand, so let's go soft power today. Let me play you the teaser for the next Ash Carter movie. It goes something like this. Bum ba-da-da-dum, bum 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 ba-da-da-da-dum, bum. My name is Bond, Ash Bond, and I'm a whiner. So it's not very sexy, is it?
No, no.
This is what he does. This is what he does. I can't understand. Let's have a Bubba Clinton I feel ya moment for Ash Carter. He needs money. He's going to lose his job in over a year. The Pentagon is desperate. They need a lot of money. So you have GWOT, the global war on terror. It doesn't work. You're not going to get a lot of money fighting a bunch of towel heads, right? So if you have double trouble, if you have Russia-China strategic partnership, if you have Russia launching Caliber missiles out of the Caspian Sea fleet, traveling 1,500 kilometers and hitting all their targets. Yep. If you have China in the South China Sea with their carrier buster missiles as well, then you have something to go. Then you have a box office hit. So forget about GWOT, now it's Russia, China. And seriously, this is already enshrined in the #1 new version of the American national military strategy. So there's nothing new here. Yeah, the whining, of course, is new because he looks so desperate.
Well, it's desperation. I tend to think of him as kind of a French comedian from the 1950s that wasn't funny. But anyway, Patrick, if I can go to you. What I find very disturbing, and Pepe is really great with the levity here, but, you know, hearing the U.S. Defense Secretary put in one category Russia, China, and ISIL. I mean, I find that so preposterous. It's dangerous. I mean, he shouldn't be holding this position. If you're going to equate those three as being on the same scale of a threat to the Washington consensus, then you need to have your head examined. Go ahead, Patrick.
Well, I think the analysis of ISIL or ISIS by people in Washington, whether they be pundits, politicians, or heads of departments, is mostly fictional. It's based on fiction. If you read what Robert Gates admitted in his recent book, that the Mujahideen was funded by the United States and was actually used to draw in Russia into Afghanistan, that is real history. The history that's received right now in Washington in mainstream discourse is fictional. So how can you not argue that what we see with ISIS is just an extension of that? So to put those in the same category as Russia and China is kind of ridiculous. But a leopard never changes his spots. And in his past life, Ash Carter was a lobbyist for the defense contractor industry. And so I would say that his interests are the same as those companies. So you need to have a threat. You need to have an opposition. You need to have some sort of existential threat to maintain the arms race. And that right now, that is the biggest fear with a lot of these companies, is that the arms race might slow down. So Ash Carter represents those corporations.
You know, Daniel, I mean, I'm always from the school of thought that you should look how the other guy sees the world, okay? Now, from that perspective, I can see that Ash Carter is worried that American hegemony after 25 years, after the end of the Cold War, is really beginning to erode and rapidly. But why does he have to react like a hammer seeing so many nails in the world? You know, someone in his position and the American political establishment would be much wiser to try to work on how the different global powers in the world need to work together and not see each other as threats. Because I don't see Russia and China looking for supremacy or domination, hardly so. But Ash Carter sees the world in a very different way. Go ahead.
Yeah, I completely agree with you, Peter. It's so interesting. I was thinking on the way into the studio that this very analogy between thinking about how you would like to be treated, it applies with individuals, and of course, it applies among nations. And if policymakers in Washington would stop and think about that for a moment, maybe some of the things that come out of their mouth wouldn't come out of their mouth. But in answer to your question, I would say a couple of things. One is that we have to remember who Ash Carter is talking to. He's not only talking to his constituents, he's talking to the American electorate who are, as we know, rather ill-informed about matters of the world in general. Mm-hmm. And when you equate Beijing and Moscow and ISIS, most people don't even know where these places are or necessarily what they are in this country. So that's the first thing. I think the second thing is that policymakers in Washington are increasingly finding that their leverage room, their ability to elbow their way around and get what it is that they want is increasingly limited in this multipolar world that we're living in. So whether it's the South China Sea or whether it's something going on in the Middle East or something going on in Europe, we're not engaging the world per se, and as a result, we're not being engaged, and we're having less and less say in what goes on.
Very interesting points there. Pepe, you know, I sometimes get the impression that the unipolar world still exists in some places in Congress and some think tanks in Washington, because everybody else knows the world has changed amazingly so over the last quarter century. But there's a few people, Victoria Nuland, Ash Carter, Hillary Clinton, a few other people like that, that just cling to the past because their model is fading away and it's not solving problems. And I look at China and Russia saying, we've had enough of your world. We need to get in there and start working together, if you like it or not. It's like pulling Washington into the 21st century. Go ahead, Pepe.
Yeah, absolutely. But these are mediocre functionaries of empire, you know, that they wouldn't even qualify to be in one of Joseph Conrad's books.
Yeah.
You remember?
Yeah.
Willard. Yeah. And as transposed later by Coppola in Apocalypse. Now, at least he was a very competent functionary of empire, an intellectual killer. These people didn't even qualify as, stand-up material. But, seriously, I don't know if you've seen Alistair Crook. Alistair Crook's the former MI6 agent at the time when MI6 was really recruiting top-class people. Not anymore. Just watch the latest Spectre, James Bond, by the way. And he wrote something extraordinary. I think he was the first one who made a fantastic connection between the 4+1 coalition in Syria, Russia, Syria, Iran, Iraq plus Hezbollah, against the NATO GCC, what I call the coalition of the dodgy opportunists. What are they saying? So when you compare what these two coalitions very far apart are doing in Syria, the developing world, the global south, can see graphically what Russia has done, especially for the past months, and what the CDO has not done for over a year. So now, as Crook put it, which I think was absolutely perfect, only 2 paragraphs, he said, the NATO-controlled, what I call the NATO Robocop world, where you decide what is war and what is peace inside their own Colosseum, and it's always thumbs down because they are the only ones to decide. This world is over. So now we have another coalition that is actually doing something to eradicate a really serious problem, which is the willful decision by the US to let Daesh grow and occupy parts of Iraq and destroy Sykes-Picot. So the developing world now, they see that there are other coalitions that are able to do the job, and it does not include regime change, it does not include humanitarian imperialism. And this is what's irking the empire of chaos and the Atlanticists big time, because now there's competition on the higher level to solve really serious problems.
Exactly. Okay, let me go to Patrick. Exactly on that point here. I think really what irks Washington and their friends, and particularly in London, is that other countries want to get engaged and solve these problems that were generated by failed Western policies in the first place. Syria has been mentioned here. Go ahead, Patrick.
Sure. I mean, you could look at the situation over the last sort of 6 weeks in Syria, and Russia is doing everything that all the defense secretaries in the United States, from Donald Rumsfeld forward, have said they wanted a lean, mobile force and so forth. So it'd be more economical if the United States just outsourced their military to Russia right now, based on the performance we've seen. So Russia's getting more bang for the buck, spending $80 billion a year on defense. The United States is spending $640 billion, but not getting these sort of results. And that's because in this, the world order that Ash Carter is talking about is really based on a really bloated system in the United States, and Russia and some of the smaller countries have a defensive posture. The United States is built on an offensive posture, so it's never going to. They're not going to get the return on investment that maybe smaller countries.
Let me go to our guest in New York real quick before we go to the break here. Okay, Daniel. One of the things I find really disturbing here is that there's mounting evidence that Washington doesn't want Russia to succeed. The invitation that was given by Damascus to defeat terrorist groups there. I don't see Washington wanting Russia to succeed. Does that bother you? Go ahead. 20 seconds before we go to the break. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think what bothers me most is the fact that we're not part of what is likely to be a solution to the Syrian problem. We're sitting there on the sidelines and we're calling everything that anyone else does a neutral action, when in fact it does have an impact there on the ground and on the potential policy that the U.S. could be following as a result.
Okay, Daniel, I'm going to jump in here. After a short break, we'll continue our discussion on the global order. Stay with RT. Welcome back to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter LeBeau. To remind you, we're discussing how the global order is evolving. Okay, I'd like to go back to Pepe in Bangkok here. I'd like to read something that Ashton Carter said here. We do not seek to make Russia an enemy, but make no mistake, the United States will defend our interests, our allies, the principled international order. That's a good one there. And the positive future it affords us all here. He doesn't want a Cold War with Russia and China. He just declared one in that sentence.
It's a non-denial denial. The Cold War 2.0 is on since Maidan in Kiev in February last year. If you follow the American press, it's absolutely crazy. And on top of it, in my case of many of my colleagues, we are inundated, our inboxes are inundated by think tank crap from all those 125 different think tanks in the US. And they are all saying the same thing. Russia, China, threat, blah, blah, blah. They're destabilizing the world order, freedom of navigation. In fact, when Carter was traveling here in Asia a few days ago, he spent 8 days here in Asia. He went everywhere. He went to the South China Sea, in fact, to promote freedom of navigation. If everybody in Southeast Asia, which the #1 trading partner happens to be China, and China trades with everybody in the ASEAN, would be interested in jeopardizing freedom of navigation. Freedom of navigation in the American imperialist sense means we decide who has freedom to navigate where. That's what it is. So it's completely stupid. There is no concept behind all this. It's desperation because they need money to reorient the Pentagon's priorities. They need to reallocate resources to the other parts of the industrial military complex. Like, the new super cyber bomber is going to be ready by 2025. If that, and it's going to be another F-35.
Well, maybe.
Probably it's not going to work,
It's
just like the
probably not
F-35.
going to work.
It's going to cost a fortune.
But it doesn't matter if it works or not. Somebody's getting paid here. Patrick, let me go to you.
Exactly, it doesn't matter.
One of the things that's very interesting, and again, Western mainstream media just doesn't have any depth. It doesn't have any memory. It doesn't work in context. It doesn't understand causality. For example, Ashton Carter has been really pushing hard for a complete revamping of the American nuclear capabilities here. But if you and saying because of Ukraine, threats to Europe, Russia's destabilizing Syria, as if that's even possible. And if you look at it, the Pentagon has been pushing for a revamp of nuclear weapons since 2010, predating the two crises that he says they need, because of these two crises, they need to revamp. I mean, nobody picks up on that. It's very simple stuff if you just read carefully, like the stuff you write at your website there. Does that disturb you, or is that something that you think is common course? Because there's no sense of memory here.
Well, what disturbs me is that, I grew up watching television, watching Jimmy Carter and Brezhnev signing a SALT II agreement and all these various landmark disarmament agreements back in the 1970s. And we look at now it's a $1 trillion program to upgrade the U.S. nuclear arsenal. And looking back through the generations now, I'm thinking, what has my generation achieved, and the generation before me? What really have they achieved in terms of moving the world towards a more peaceful world? Instead, we're in a hyper arms race right now. Yep. So I see that as a problem. The other thing is that there's a lot of talk about platitudes and respecting national sovereignty and airspaces and navigation and the rights of freedom of expression. But who's protecting Edward Snowden's rights right now? Will he get a fair trial if he goes to the United States? Russia's protecting Snowden's rights. Who's protecting Bradley Manning or Chelsea Manning's rights? Did he get a fair trial? Is Julian Assange going to get a fair trial? This is what's really going on right now in the West, and it's totally the complete opposite of all the sort of platitudes that Ash Carter is putting across in his Reagan Library speech recently. Yep. So, the West has a lot to answer for, and I believe they're really tangled up in their own web of lies at the moment, and it's showing.
Yeah, Daniel, again, putting myself in the other guy's shoes, okay? If I were sitting in Moscow or Beijing and I got a transcript of what Ash Carter said at his speech there, and I'm the leader of Japan, of China or Russia, and I'd say, they call us a threat. Well, I should be afraid, and I should be prepared. And I should be working on my military as well. I mean, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. It's like I always tell my Russian friends here in Moscow, is that everything, all the garbage that is written about Russia in the Washington Post and the New York Times, it's instantly translated into Russian, and the middle class here, educated middle class here, reads and say, see, that's what they really think about us. They don't like us, and they treat us without respect. And you turn an entire middle class against you. Do you see my point here?
I do, and it goes back to your earlier point about the evolving, or shall we say the de facto Cold War. It seems that there are certain entities that want the Cold War on. Certainly the military in the U.S. wants the Cold War on. That's very good for business. But the bigger point from my perspective is this evolving Cold War is bad for everybody involved.
I agree.
And whether people want it or not, it seems like they're just going to get it. And we're barreling towards this, and people aren't even thinking about what the consequences are. Who wants another Cold War? Why aren't we not embracing Russia and China and other powers to try and solve the plethora of world's problems? Why are we going back to this 1950s era Russia bogeyman stuff? It just makes no sense whatsoever.
Absolutely, because Pepe, again, to remind our viewers in America that weren't taught history very well, you have to remember the perspective that the Western democracies had towards Stalin's Russia, the Soviet Union in the 1930s. And then you had the scourge of Nazism conquering the continent. And you know what? Wise men, cooler heads made a decision. We got to work together to snuff this out, because this is a real scourge on humanity. You didn't have to like Stalin. You didn't have to like the Soviet Union. You didn't have to like communism. But the fact that they were fighting against the Nazis was good enough. But I don't see that kind of goodwill coming out of Washington to fight ISIL in Syria or Iraq.
No, the goodwill, in fact, is only to work side by side with the House of Saud and with the Wahhabis in Saudi Arabia, which are the ideological matrix of everything that is connected to Salafi jihadism anywhere in the world. So if you don't fight Saudi Arabia as a whole, the construct, the oil hacienda, you know, the madrasas being financed all over the world. I've seen this all across MENA, even before 9/11, from Mali to Java. You know, I was seeing this in front of me during the 90s already. And Saudi Arabia money was all over MENA, Middle East, Northern Africa, which later the Pentagon said was part of the arc of instability. And who destabilized the arc, essentially? Wahhabi proselytism. If you don't fight that, obviously you cannot fight ISIS, ISIL, Daesh, which is the latest manifestation of the same phenomenon. Everybody knows that 55 top imams in Saudi Arabia, they declared a jihad in Russia again, like we're back to the Afghan jihad in the 1980s. Al-Azhar in Cairo, which is run by a bunch of creepy old bastards, is going to do the same thing sooner or later. Jihad against Russia. So if you don't find conceptually this 7th century interpretation of Islam, in fact, which is a complete distortion of what Islam is all about, we are not going anywhere. And obviously, you simply cannot explain that to the industrial military complex or to those clowns in Congress, because they don't even know what that means.
But what's interesting here, if I can go to Patrick here, you know, this Wahhabi extremism is reflected in the neocon policies in Washington, D.C. They are twins. They are connected at the hip, and they need each other to exist, to coexist, because only chaos allows them both to exist in the form that they have. This is a perfect convenience on both sides here, because in Washington, for some reason, they have this delusion that they are still masters of the universe as the Russians ring circles around them in the Middle East. That's the reality. Patrick.
Yeah, and the recent air disaster in the Sinai Peninsula is a perfect example of this. You have the United States and Britain absolutely screaming, demanding that they say ISIS put a bomb on this plane. Now, even before the evidence and before the investigation is concluded, it's because that's Washington's wheelhouse. It's ISIS, it's Al-Qaeda. So the symbiosis between radical Islamic extremist militant Islam and Washington, D.C. and the UK and NATO, it's absolute symbiosis. They can't, I mean, you take that problem out, you take that narrative out, and then what is the enemy? What is the existential threat? Is it Russia then? It's China? You know, when we get rid of ISIS, is it going to be back to, you know, an increased Cold War? One thing, I'll say this, though. The situation in Syria has shown that balance was achieved when another player came in to enter into the situation. Before that, it was completely off balance, out of kilter. The only thing keeping the United States from doing that before 1990 was the USSR. That created the balance in the world, a multipolar world. So I think a multipolar world is a more healthy world going forward.
Daniel, there is evidence that there's some progress being made in Syria, and it's because of the Russian intervention. Do you think it's possible that that could somehow be spun as a way to re-engage Russia as a partner? Because the level of rhetoric is so poisoned right now in Washington that I can't see how we can get back to more normal times. Maybe Syria could be a positive. Go ahead. Last word on the program. Go ahead.
Yeah, in fact, I would totally agree with that. A couple of weeks ago, I wrote a piece in the Huffington Post basically saying all roads to peace in the Middle East now are leading to Moscow. And that's not a very popular thing to necessarily be saying on this side of the pond. But it seems to me that by grabbing the reins and by taking control and doing something bold, everyone's suddenly looking toward Moscow and saying, well, okay, we have a leader. And we have a power that's actually doing something against this menace. So why don't we join forces with them? I think that's actually starting to happen behind the scenes.
Well, those are words of pragmatism. Gentlemen, we've run out of time. Many thanks to my guests in Bangkok, Phoenix, and in New York. And thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time. And remember, crosstalk rules. believes that this will not be scientists. I love you.